Before Dracula wore a cape, the dead were already walking across Europe. Not in castles, but in villages. Not as monsters from fiction, but as neighbors, friends, even family. In the age of plague and superstition, people opened graves, drove stakes through corpses and burned bodies, not out of madness but fear. They believed the dead were feeding on the living. Tonight, we journey beyond Dracula to uncover forgotten European vampire folklore, stories history tried to bury but never truly killed. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoy dark history, myths, and legends, you're in the right place. Let's begin. The Slavic undead, from grave to hearth. The image of the undead in Slavic folklore is neither static nor singular. It emerges instead from a dense web of beliefs about death, the body, the household, and the fragile boundary between the living and the dead. Unlike later literary vampires, the Slavic undead were not distant aristocratic predators haunting castles or ruins. They were intimate figures, neighbors, relatives, former members of the household, whose return from the grave threatened the moral, social, and spiritual order of the community. This chapter traces the conceptual journey of the Slavic undead from burial ground to domestic space, examining how anxiety surrounding improper death, unfulfilled obligations, and communal memory transformed the dead into dangerous presences within the hearth-centered world of traditional Slavic life. Death and the incomplete passage. In pre-Christian Slavic cosmology, death was not a singular event but a process. The soul's transition from the world of the living to the realm of ancestors required correct ritual action, temporal patience, and communal participation. When this process was disrupted, through sudden death, improper burial, social transgression, or ritual neglect, the dead could fail to complete their passage. Such souls were believed to linger in a liminal state, neither fully alive nor fully dead, capable of returning to the world they had left behind. This liminality lies at the heart of Slavic undead traditions. The undead were not evil by nature, rather they were unfinished. A person who died violently, committed grave sins, practiced sorcery, or was excluded from proper funerary rites risked becoming a restless corpse. Similarly, those who died without confession, reconciliation, or the fulfillment of social duties, such as marriage or repayment of debts, were believed to carry unresolved ties that bound them to the living world. The undead thus embodied a failure of closure, both spiritual and social. The grave as threshold, not barrier. The grave in Slavic belief functioned less as a sealed boundary than as a permeable threshold. Folk traditions across Eastern and Southern Slavic regions describe the dead as capable of movement, perception, and even physical interaction with the living. Corpses that failed to decay properly showed signs of ruddy complexion, bloating, or flexible limbs were interpreted as evidence of post-mortem activity rather than natural decomposition. Burial practices reflect this anxiety. Bodies were often bound, staked, weighted with stones, or buried face down to prevent their return. Sharp objects, knives, sickles, or thorns, might be placed in coffins as apotropaic measures, both to restrain the corpse and to ward off malevolent forces. These actions reveal a belief that the grave itself did not neutralize danger. Active intervention was required to ensure that the dead remained dead. Importantly, the undead did not always rise immediately. In many traditions, a period of 40 days marked a critical interval during which the soul lingered near the body and household. This temporal window allowed for both benevolent and dangerous interactions. Failure to observe proper mourning customs during this time could provoke the dead, increasing the risk of their return in corporeal form. From cemetery to village. The movement of the undead from the grave into the village represents a shift from abstract fear to immediate threat. Slavic undead were not solitary wanderers. They followed familiar paths, returned to known places, and sought out those with whom they had shared emotional or social bonds. Their first visits were often directed toward family members, particularly spouses, children, or parents. This behavior underscores the deeply relational nature of Slavic undead beliefs. The dead returned not merely to feed or harm indiscriminately, but to reclaim roles they had held in life. A deceased husband might return to his wife's bed, draining her vitality through nightly visits. A dead child might cry outside the home, compelling grieving parents to open the door. Such encounters blurred the line between mourning and terror, transforming love and memory into sources of vulnerability. The undead thus functioned as distorted continuations of social identity. They remembered their homes, their obligations, and their desires, but lacked the moral restraint and spiritual coherence of the living. This inversion made them particularly dangerous. They were familiar enough to be trusted, yet altered enough to destroy. The hearth as sacred center. In Slavic domestic belief, the hearth was more than a source of warmth or sustenance. It was the spiritual core of the household. Associated with ancestral spirits, domestic deities, and protective forces, the hearth symbolized continuity between generations. To cross its threshold without invitation was a violation of sacred order. The arrival of the undead at the hearth therefore represented a profound disruption. Folk narratives frequently describe undead figures standing at the threshold, calling out to those inside. Crucially, they could not enter unless invited. This motif reflects a broader belief in the power of verbal consent and ritual boundaries. The spoken word, once given, could undo protective measures and allow the dead access to the living space. Once inside, the undead corrupted the domestic sphere. Food soured, livestock sickened, and family members wasted away. The hearth, once a site of protection, became a conduit for decay. In this way, the undead inverted the household's function, transforming a space of life and continuity into one of slow death, consumption and contagion. Unlike later literary vampires, Slavic undead were not always defined by blood drinking alone. While many traditions describe the consumption of blood, breath, or life force, others emphasize more subtle forms of depletion. The undead might sit on a person's chest at night, induce illness, or cause unexplained fatigue. In some accounts, they consumed food alongside the living, yet whatever they touched spoiled soon after. This emphasis on consumption aligns the undead with broader fears of scarcity and contagion. In agrarian communities dependent on fragile food supplies, unexplained loss or illness could threaten survival. The undead thus personified invisible forces of decay, disease, famine, and misfortune, given a recognizable human face. Moreover, the presence of an undead individual was believed to be contagious. Those harmed by them might themselves become undead after death, creating a cycle of affliction. This fear reinforced communal vigilance and justified extreme measures, including exhumation and ritual destruction of suspected corpses. Community response and ritual justice. The identification and neutralization of the undead was rarely an individual act. It required communal consensus, ritual authority, and collective responsibility. Elders, priests, or ritual specialists were often called upon to diagnose the cause of recurring illness or death. Signs such as disturbed graves, unusual animal behavior, or recurring dreams involving the deceased served as evidence. Once identified, the undead were subjected to ritualized violence. Exhumation allowed the community to confront the physical remains of the threat. The corpse might be staked, decapitated, burned, or reburied with corrective rites. These acts were not seen as desecration, but as necessary justice, restoring balance between worlds. Notably, these rituals often combined Christian and pre-Christian elements. Prayers, holy water, and crosses were used alongside older practices involving fire, iron, and earth. This syncretism reflects the adaptability of Slavic undead beliefs, which persisted and evolved despite religious transformation. Memory, guilt, and the fear of return. At a deeper level, the Slavic undead represent unresolved memory. They are the dead who refuse to remain silent, whose presence forces the living to confront past failures, neglected rituals, broken promises, or social exclusion. The fear of the undead is therefore inseparable from guilt. Communities that failed to care for their dead properly risked their return. This dynamic reveals an ethical dimension to undead folklore. The living were responsible not only for their own conduct, but for ensuring the proper integration of the dead into the ancestral order. When this responsibility was neglected, the boundary between grave and hearth collapsed. Intimacy of horror. The Slavic undead are terrifying not because they are monstrous but because they are familiar. They emerge from the same social fabric as the living, shaped by shared spaces, relationships, and obligations. Their journey from grave to hearth maps a trajectory of increasing intimacy, culminating in the invasion of the most sacred domestic space. In this sense, the undead serve as mirrors, reflecting communal fears about death, memory, and the consequences of neglect. They remind us that in Slavic tradition, the boundary between life and death was not enforced by distance or forgetfulness, but by ritual care and collective remembrance. When those safeguards failed, the dead did not remain in the ground. They came home. The Mediterranean Revenant, the Vrykolakas. The sea has always been an accomplice to memory. Along the Mediterranean, it preserves voices long after bodies are lost, carrying them from island to island like contraband. In this borderland of water and stone, where orthodox bells compete with cicadas and the dead are never fully silent, there emerged a revenant unlike the aristocratic vampire of the north or the feral ghoul of the Balkans. The Greeks called it the Vrykolakas, a word as heavy as the thing it named, salted with centuries of fear, theology, and the slow erosion of certainty. Unlike the Transylvanian vampire, the Vrykolakas did not arrive wrapped in velvet or courtly decadence. It came instead in the familiar shape of the neighbor, the uncle, the man who once drank coffee beside you in the square. The terror lay not in its otherness but in its stubborn sameness. The Vrykolakas returned as it had lived, dressed plainly, walking openly, knocking on doors in the afternoon sun. It was not always nocturnal. In some accounts it preferred the hour just before dusk, when shadows lengthen but are not yet accusatory. Its power was not seduction but persistence. The origins of the Vrykolakas are inseparable from the spiritual anxieties of the Greek Orthodox world. In a theology where the body awaited resurrection and the soul's journey was neither immediate nor simple, decay became a moral indicator. A corpse that did not decompose properly was not merely a biological anomaly, it was a sign of spiritual failure. Excommunication, improper burial, unresolved sin, or death under a curse could anchor the soul to the flesh. The result was not a predator thirsting for blood, but a being trapped between liturgy and rot. Western travelers to Greece in the 17th and 18th centuries were both fascinated and appalled by what they recorded. They wrote of exhumations conducted with solemn efficiency, of villagers gathering while priests read prayers and men with knives and axes prepared to do what faith alone could not. The corpse, often described as swollen, ruddy, and intact, seemed to confirm the worst fears. Blood might trickle from its nose or mouth when pierced. To the outsider, these were natural effects of decomposition. To the villagers, they were proof of animation. The Vrykolakas did not always kill directly. Its presence was enough. It spread illness, blighted crops, soured milk, and brought an oppressive malaise upon the community. People wasted away not from bites but from exhaustion and dread. In some stories, the Revenant called out names at night. Those who answered would soon fall ill and die. This calling motif, death by acknowledgement, suggests a cultural fear not of violence but of recognition. To be named by the dead was to be claimed by them. Islands were particularly vulnerable. Crete, Santorini, Mykonos, and Chios all produced variations of the legend, shaped by isolation and maritime trade. On an island, the dead had fewer places to go unnoticed. A revenant could not simply wander off, it would circle back again and again like a tide. This circularity reinforced the belief that the Vrykolakas was bound to its place of origin, cursed to haunt the limits of its former life. Accounts differ on how the Vrykolakas sustained itself. Some insist it fed on human flesh, stealing into homes to consume livers or hearts. Others claim it absorbed vitality more abstractly, draining life through proximity alone. Blood, the central obsession of later vampire lore, was only one of many possible currencies. What mattered was not nourishment but disruption. The Vrykolakas existed to disturb the boundary between living order and funerary closure. Christian ritual offered both cause and cure. A person who had violated sacred law in life, by heresy, sacrilege, or moral corruption, was thought especially prone to becoming a Vrykolakas. Yet the Church also provided the tools for defense. Prayers, exorcisms, and memorial services could sometimes release the soul. In other cases, harsher measures were required. The heart might be removed and burned. The body could be decapitated or entirely incinerated, with ashes scattered at sea. Fire and salt, elements of purification, were the final arbiters. There is a telling ambiguity in these practices. The destruction of the corpse was not undertaken lightly. It was a communal act, heavy with grief and reluctance. The revenant was still, in some sense, one of their own. Killing it again was both a necessity and a violation. This tension distinguishes the Vrykolakas from more monstrous undead. It was not an enemy invasion but a failure of the community's spiritual hygiene, a mirror held up to collective guilt. The word Vrykolakas itself reflects a layered history. Linguists trace it to Slavic roots, likely derived from Varkolak, a term associated with werewolves and shapeshifters. As the concept migrated south into Greek culture, it shed its Lupin aspects and absorbed orthodox eschatology. What remained was a creature of return rather than transformation. The Vrykolakas did not become something else, it refused to stop being what it had been. This refusal resonates with broader Mediterranean attitudes toward death. Unlike cultures that emphasize rupture and finality, Greek folk belief often treated death as a prolonged negotiation. The dead lingered in memory, in dreams, in the physical spaces they once occupied. The Vrykolakas represents the nightmare version of this continuity, memory that will not fade, presence without permission. By the 19th century, as medical explanations for decomposition became more widespread, belief in the Vrykolakas began to wane. Yet it never disappeared entirely. Even skeptics recorded stories with a measure of unease, noting how often rational arguments failed to comfort those who had seen a body that would not rot. Enlightenment did not fully dissolve the dread, it merely changed its vocabulary. In modern Greek literature and cinema, echoes of the Vrykolakas persist, often stripped of explicit supernaturalism but retaining the themes of return and unresolved guilt. The Revenant becomes a metaphor for history itself, occupations, civil wars, betrayals that refuse burial. The past walks again, demanding acknowledgement, and those who answer suffer. What makes the Vrykolakas enduring is not its ability to kill, but its insistence on proximity. It does not lurk in distant castles or foreign forests. It comes from the same earth, the same churchyard, the same bloodline. It embodies the fear that the boundary between life and death is not guarded by nature alone, but by fragile human rituals that can fail. In the end, the Mediterranean Revenant teaches a quieter, more corrosive lesson than its northern cousins. Evil does not always arrive with fangs bared. Sometimes it knocks politely, speaks in a familiar voice and waits to be let in, not because it must be invited, but because we are compelled to answer our own dead. The Western Shadows, France, Germany, and the British Isles. Western Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries was a region of deep contradictions. Industrial progress paired with social unrest, political liberalization shadowed by reactionary backlash, and cultural brilliance entwined with imperial violence. France, the German lands, and the British Isles stood at the center of these tensions. Their histories during this period cannot be understood in isolation. They were bound together by war and diplomacy, trade and rivalry, ideas and fears. The Western shadows were cast not only by armies and factories, but by the long silhouettes of revolution, nationalism, and empire stretching across the continent. France. Revolution remembered and reimagined. France entered the 19th century carrying the unresolved legacy of the Revolution. Though Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself emperor in 1804, he remained in many ways the heir of 1789. His legal reforms, particularly the Napoleonic Code, institutionalized revolutionary principles of equality before the law and secular governance, even as political freedom was curtailed. France under Napoleon became both a model and a warning to the rest of Europe, a nation energized by mass mobilization and meritocracy, yet disciplined under authoritarian rule. The defeat of Napoleon in 1815 did not extinguish the revolutionary flame. Instead, it forced it underground, where it smoldered through the Restoration and re-emerged in periodic upheavals. The July Revolution of 1830 replaced one monarchy with another, revealing the limits of bourgeois liberalism. The Revolution of 1848 went further, briefly establishing the Second Republic and proclaiming universal male suffrage. Yet once again, hopes for a democratic and socially just France were frustrated when Louis Napoleon Bonaparte seized power and later declared himself emperor. What distinguished France from many of its neighbors was not the absence of reaction, but the persistence of political imagination. French society repeatedly returned to fundamental questions: who should rule? In whose name? And by what right? These debates played out not only in assemblies and barricades, but in literature, art, and philosophy. From Victor Hugo's moral grandeur to the realism of Balzac and Zola, French culture grappled openly with inequality, ambition, and moral responsibility. The collapse of the Second Empire in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 marked a turning point. Defeat at the hands of Prussia shattered French confidence and resulted in the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, a wound that would fester for decades. The Paris Commune of 1871, brutally suppressed, became a symbol of both revolutionary possibility and state violence. Out of this trauma emerged the Third Republic. Fragile, contested, yet enduring. It invested heavily in secular education, civic identity, and colonial expansion, seeking redemption and prestige abroad while consolidating republican values at home. Yet the shadow of division never fully receded. The Dreyfus Affair at the end of the century exposed deep fractures along lines of religion, class, and nationalism. France, for all its revolutionary heritage, remained a battleground between universal ideals and exclusionary fears. Germany, from fragmentation to forged unity. Where France wrestled with the meaning of revolution, the German lands confronted the problem of unity. At the beginning of the 19th century, Germany existed only as a cultural and linguistic concept. Politically, it was a mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, and free cities loosely bound by tradition and memory. The Holy Roman Empire's dissolution in 1806 formalized what had long been apparent. Fragmentation was both Germany's condition and its curse. Napoleon's domination of Central Europe paradoxically accelerated German nationalism. Resistance to French rule fostered a sense of shared destiny, articulated by philosophers, poets, and historians who emphasized language, folklore, and history as the foundations of nationhood. Yet this nationalism was often conservative in tone, wary of revolutionary excess and committed to order as much as freedom. The revolutions of 1848 briefly raised hopes for a liberal, constitutional Germany. The Frankfurt Parliament attempted to create a unified nation-state grounded in law and representation. Its failure revealed the limits of idealism in the face of entrenched power. Prussia and Austria, the two dominant German states, were unwilling to surrender authority to a parliamentary experiment. Unification came instead through what was later called blood and iron. Under Otto von Bismarck, Prussia engineered a series of wars that reconfigured the balance of power, against Denmark, Austria, and finally France. The proclamation of the German Empire in 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, was rich in symbolism and resentment. Germany was unified but under Prussian leadership, authoritarian in structure and militarized in spirit. The new empire combined rapid industrialization with political rigidity. Germany became an economic powerhouse, its factories, railways, and universities among the most advanced in the world. At the same time, real political power remained concentrated in the hands of the Kaiser and his ministers. Bismarck sought to manage social tensions through a combination of repression and innovation, introducing pioneering social welfare programs even as he curtailed socialist movements. German identity in this period was marked by confidence and anxiety in equal measure. Pride in scientific and industrial achievement coexisted with fears of encirclement and internal division. Nationalism grew more assertive, increasingly racialized and exclusionary, casting long shadows into the 20th century. The British Isles, stability, reform, and imperial reach. The British Isles followed a different trajectory, one defined less by rupture than by adaptation. Britain avoided the revolutions that shook the continent, not because it was immune to social tensions, but because its political system proved flexible enough to absorb pressure. The monarchy endured, but its power was steadily constrained by parliament, law, and convention. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain more profoundly than any other European society. Factories, cities, and new technologies reshaped everyday life, creating immense wealth alongside extreme poverty. Social inequality became impossible to ignore, and reform emerged as both a moral and pragmatic necessity. The Reform Acts of the 19th century gradually expanded the electorate, integrating the middle and working classes into political life. British political culture prized continuity and compromise. Change was framed not as revolution but as improvement. This self-image was reinforced by a powerful narrative of constitutional liberty, which contrasted Britain's path with the perceived instability of France and the authoritarianism of Germany. Yet this narrative often obscured the violence and coercion that underpinned British power beyond Europe. Ireland represented the most immediate and troubling exception to Britain's image of orderly progress. Governed from London and shaped by centuries of conquest, Ireland endured land dispossession, religious discrimination, and economic dependency. The Great Famine of the 1840s exposed the catastrophic consequences of imperial policy and neglect. Irish demands for autonomy grew steadily, challenging British assumptions about unity and consent. Beyond the British Isles, the empire expanded across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Imperial dominance reinforced Britain's global influence and economic strength, but it also shaped domestic society. Ideas of racial hierarchy and civilizational mission filtered back to the metropole, influencing culture and politics. The empire became both a source of pride and a moral burden, its contradictions increasingly difficult to reconcile. Intersections and rivalries. The histories of France, Germany, and the British Isles were deeply intertwined. War was the most dramatic point of contact, but diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange were equally significant. The balance of power systems sought to prevent any single state from dominating Europe, yet it also normalized rivalry and suspicion. Britain viewed continental conflicts through the lens of stability and access, intervening selectively to protect trade routes and prevent hegemonic threats. France oscillated between seeking continental influence and compensating for European setbacks through colonial expansion. Germany, unified late, pursued recognition and security with an intensity that unsettled its neighbors. Ideas crossed borders as readily as armies. Liberalism, socialism, nationalism, and imperialism were not confined to one nation. They were shared languages of modernity. Each society adapted them to local conditions, producing distinct yet comparable outcomes. The result was a Europe increasingly interconnected, yet increasingly volatile. By the early 20th century, the Western shadows had lengthened. Beneath the surface of progress lay unresolved tensions between democracy and authority, inclusion and exclusion, peace and power. France remained haunted by defeat and division, Germany by ambition and insecurity, and Britain by the moral costs of empire. Together, they shaped a world poised on the edge of transformation, their intertwined destinies foreshadowing the conflicts that would soon engulf Europe and beyond. In these shadows, the modern West took form, not as a unified ideal, but as a contested space where history's brightest achievements and darkest impulses coexisted, inseparable and enduring. From folklore to fiction, what was lost and what remains? The movement from folklore to literary fiction is not merely a change of medium. It is a transformation of function, authority, and meaning. Folklore originates in communal experience, shaped by repetition, adaptation, and shared belief. Fiction, particularly in its modern literary form, tends toward individual authorship, textual fixity, and aesthetic self-consciousness. This chapter examines what is diminished, altered, or erased in that transition, as well as what endures, sometimes unexpectedly, within fictional adaptations of folkloric material. By tracing the losses and survivals embedded in this shift, we can better understand how folklore continues to shape narrative imagination even as it is reshaped by literary convention. The communal voice and its displacement. One of the most significant losses in the move from folklore to fiction is the communal voice. Folktales are traditionally anonymous, their authority derived not from a single creator but from collective transmission. Each retelling subtly modifies the story, allowing it to respond to changing social conditions, local values, and audience expectations. Meaning is therefore negotiated rather than fixed. When such tales are transcribed or adapted into fiction, this fluidity is often replaced by authorial control. The story becomes a version rather than a process. This displacement has profound implications. In folklore, contradictions coexist without requiring resolution. Variants are not errors but evidence of vitality. Fiction, by contrast, often demands coherence, psychological motivation, and narrative closure. The author selects, refines, and stabilizes the tale, privileging one interpretation over others. While this can yield depth and nuance, it also silences alternative voices, particularly those of marginalized or non-literate communities whose storytelling traditions rarely survive outside oral transmission. Yet traces of the communal voice sometimes remain. Framing devices such as fictional storytellers or layered narratives attempt to simulate oral conditions. Dialect, repetition, and episodic structure can gesture toward folkloric origins. Even so, these are approximations rather than continuations. The authority of the text ultimately rests with the author and the literary institution that legitimizes it. Ritual, belief, and the loss of function. Folklore is deeply entangled with belief systems and ritual practices. Myths explain cosmology, legends negotiate history and place, and folktales often encode moral or social instruction. Their power lies not solely in narrative pleasure but in their functional role within a culture. When such stories are adapted into fiction, their ritual efficacy is frequently diminished or lost altogether. In literary contexts, supernatural elements that once commanded belief may be reinterpreted symbolically or psychologically. Spirits become metaphors, monsters become projections of inner conflict, and magic becomes aesthetic ornamentation. This shift aligns with modern secular sensibilities but distances the narrative from its original cultural logic. What was once a living belief becomes an imaginative exercise. However, this loss of function is accompanied by a gain in interpretive openness. Fiction allows readers to engage with folkloric material without requiring shared belief. Themes embedded in ritual, fear of death, reverence for nature, social cohesion, can be explored abstractly, reaching audiences far removed from the original cultural context. While the story no longer does what it once did, it may still mean something, albeit differently. Moral ambiguity and narrative complexity. Traditional folklore often presents morality in stark terms. Characters embody virtues or vices, and outcomes reinforce communal norms. Such clarity serves an instructive purpose, especially in societies where oral storytelling functions as an educational tool. Literary fiction, on the other hand, tends to value ambiguity, irony, and psychological depth. When folklore is adapted into fiction, moral binaries are frequently destabilized. This transformation can be seen as both loss and enrichment. On one hand, the erosion of clear moral frameworks can obscure the social values the original tale sought to reinforce. On the other, complexity allows for critical engagement. Villains may be humanized, heroes problematized, and moral lessons questioned rather than accepted. Fiction thus reclaims folklore as a space for ethical exploration rather than moral prescription. Importantly, some folkloric motifs are remarkably resilient to moral complication. The trickster, for example, thrives in ambiguity, resisting easy categorization even in traditional contexts. Such figures transition smoothly into fiction, suggesting that folklore itself contains seeds of narrative complexity that literature merely amplifies rather than invents. The persistence of archetype and motif. Despite significant transformations, many core elements of folklore endure within fiction. Archetypes, such as the hero's journey, the wise elder, the forbidden threshold, continue to structure narratives across genres. These patterns, identified by scholars such as Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, suggest that folklore taps into deep cognitive or cultural frameworks that remain compelling even when stripped of their original context. Motifs also persist, often detached from their initial meanings. The enchanted forest, for instance, may no longer function as a literal site of danger and transformation rooted in pre-modern anxieties about wilderness. Instead, it becomes a symbolic space for psychological or existential testing. The motif survives, but its reference shifts. This persistence indicates that folklore's imaginative vocabulary retains power even as its grammar changes. Fiction writers draw upon folkloric imagery not out of antiquarian interest alone, but because such imagery offers a shorthand for complex experiences. Readers, in turn, respond intuitively, recognizing patterns that feel familiar even when they cannot name their origins. Orality, performance, and the written word. Another casualty of the transition from folklore to fiction is performance. Oral storytelling is a dynamic, embodied act shaped by voice, gesture, timing, and audience interaction. Meaning emerges not just from the words spoken but from the context in which they are delivered. Written fiction, by contrast, is silent and solitary. It cannot adjust itself in response to its audience, nor can it fully replicate the immediacy of live narration. Literary techniques, such as rhythmical prose, direct address, or nonlinear structure, can evoke aspects of orality, but they remain substitutes. The reader becomes an interpreter rather than a participant. This shift alters the social function of storytelling, moving it from communal space to private experience. Yet the written word also preserves what performance cannot: longevity and reach. Folklore that enters fiction gains stability and can travel across time and geography. While this preservation often comes at the cost of local specificity, it ensures survival. In this sense, fiction acts as both archive and transformation, freezing one moment of a story's evolution while enabling new forms of circulation. Cultural ownership and appropriation. The adaptation of folklore into fiction raises questions of cultural ownership. When authors draw upon traditions not their own, especially those of colonized or marginalized peoples, what is lost may include context, nuance, and agency. Folkloric elements can be aestheticized or exoticized, severed from the communities that produced them. At the same time, fiction can function as a site of recovery and resistance. Writers from within these communities often reclaim folklore, reshaping it to address contemporary concerns and historical injustices. In such cases, what remains is not merely motif or archetype, but a living dialogue between past and present. The folkloric tradition persists, not as static inheritance, but as adaptive resource. What ultimately remains? What remains after folklore becomes fiction is neither negligible nor intact. The communal voice fades, but collective memory lingers in archetype and motif. Ritual function diminishes, but symbolic resonance expands. Performance is lost, but preservation is gained. Fiction cannot fully replace folklore, nor does it entirely sever itself from it. Instead, the relationship is best understood as one of transformation rather than decline. Folklore does not disappear when it enters fiction, it changes state. Its meanings are renegotiated, its functions reassigned, and its forms reshaped to suit new audiences and cultural conditions. The losses are real and significant, particularly in terms of community, belief, and immediacy. Yet what remains, narrative pattern, imaginative power, and cultural memory, continues to inform storytelling in profound ways. In recognizing both what was lost and what remains, we gain a clearer view of fiction's debt to folklore and folklore's enduring presence within literary art. The transition from one to the other is not an ending, but an ongoing process, one that reflects broader shifts in how societies tell stories, make meaning, and remember themselves. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, these vampires were never strangers. They were neighbors, relatives, people once loved. Proof that the greatest monsters are born from fear, loss, and the unknown. Dracula gave us a legend. But these stories gave us warnings shaped by plague, faith, and humanity's struggle to understand death itself. Long after the graves were sealed, the fear endured. Thank you for watching Beyond Dracula, Unearthing Forgotten European Vampire Folklore. If this journey into forgotten myths intrigued you, consider liking, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts below. Until next time, sleep well, and remember the past never truly stays buried.